Okay. Okay, comrades. It's 5 o'clock in the UK on Sunday the 14th. Welcome to this week's online communist forum. This is the penultimate online communist forum before the Christmas break. This afternoon or this evening, we are exploring the situation around Nicolas Maduro and Venezuela. And without any further ado, actually, there is further ado. As with anyone who's been to these communist forums before, you can make comments in the chat. However, if you wish to speak, you can indicate using the reactions menu item and raise your hand. And we'll then make you a panel member if you're not already one, so that you can speak. There is normally a small gap if you're made a panel member. It does look like your connection has dropped out and then you're brought back in again. So having said that, over to Jack Conrad of the PCC.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. I'm going to talk about Venezuela. I've got no particular knowledge, inside information, but I have to say that having looked at one or two good documentaries over the years on the coup in Iran against Mossadegh, I think 1953, this has all the, at least to me, all the signs of an orchestrated, carefully choreographed operation. I'm sure there's, just like there was in 53 between the UK and America, luck, accident, and all the rest of it. Nonetheless, what we've got, to me at least, looks like an operation to change the regime. We've had years and years of sanctions, sabotage, hostile operations, assassination squads. Now we've had attacks on small boats in the Caribbean. I don't know whether they're carrying drugs. How you detect that they're carrying drugs, I don't know, from a satellite, from a spy plane. I don't know. I mean, after the boat sunk, do they send divers down to investigate? I think 80 people or thereabouts have been killed so far. We've also had the seizure of, let me get the name right, the Skipper. This is this oil tanker that you had Coast Guards, Marines, and Special Forces landing on. This is one of these oil tankers that are used basically to evade sanctions. China uses them, Russia uses them, Iran uses them, and one would guess Venezuela also uses them. So America has seized this ship on the high seas. My understanding is that, this is an act of piracy. We're talking about law, and it's certainly not an act of piracy in order to gain one ship and, X million tons or whatever, or barrels of oil. And it's all part of the operation. Now, again, I'm sure, that if you take the awarding of the Nobel Peace Prize, that wouldn't have been part of it. Nonetheless, it fitted in with it, didn't it? If we look at Manchedo's, how should I put it, Peace Prize, she's pro-Israel, anti-Palestinian. She's a right-wing, how should I put it, regime change operative. But what was certainly part of the regime change operation, the coup operation, is getting her out of Venezuela over there to Oslo to make her speech on cue. On top of that, we've had the closure of airspace by the United States. And we've also had the deployment of very large, armed forces, the Gerald Ford, is it Gerald R. Ford? I can't remember the middle name. Either way, that's the world's largest aircraft carrier, has been stationed off the coast of Venezuela. And we've had the deployment of 15,000 American troops. My guess, for what it's worth, is what they're trying to do is provoke a military coup, or enough people in Maduro's circle basically saying the game's over, time to get out, time to go to Havana, Moscow, or wherever else, follow the Assad route of bailing out while you can. Who knows? But I would take the 15,000 troops seriously. I think that the United States could very easily overthrow the regime. That's just a guess. I could be utterly wrong. What I am certain about, there was an interview with an ongoing advisor to the Lula regime in Brazil, and he was saying, look, if America goes in, this will be Latin America's Vietnam War. I don't think so. If you look at the history of the Communist Party of Vietnam, if you look at the anti-colonial struggle against the French, and following that, in essence, the Americans, this isn't going to happen there. And also, it's worth emphasizing that Vietnam was in receipt of Chinese aid and aid from the Soviet Union, and had behind it, the World Communist Movement, massive solidarity campaign. Now, we have to ask the question, why is America doing this? And why is it doing it now? I've talked about sanctions. They began way back in the days of Chavez. We all know the story there. He was a military man. He tried to carry out a coup. It failed. It became popular. Why? Because of the extreme uneven distribution of oil wealth. Here's the country with, I think, the largest proven reserves of oil in the world. Now, we ought to be careful there because, as I think I've pointed out before, this is old figures, and just take them for the purposes of illustration. To extract a barrel of oil in Saudi Arabia, in inverted commas, $2. That's how much it costs to get out. On the other hand, to extract a barrel of oil from the Arctic costs $180. So we're not talking about, Venezuela being the equivalent of a Saudi Arabia, where almost you put a stick in the ground and oil comes out. Nonetheless, it's an oil-rich country. It's historically been a supplier to the United States, and historically that oil has either gone to oil companies, or it's gone to the Venezuelan state, and from the Venezuelan state, it's gone to the Venezuelan elite. And what Chavez did, having been elected, not through a coup, but being elected, is he pledged to redistribute this oil wealth. And that's what he did. There's no doubt about that. You had, huge programs of housing, education, food. You also had a situation of where he was lucky and oil prices were high. This is in the early 2000s. And what you had, throughout the world is a lot of people, like revolutionary tourists looking at Venezuela and saying, this is the socialism of the 21st century. This is where, for example, RS-21 get their sort of name from. So there's quite a lot of books, quite a lot of, political organizations named 21 because this was meant to be the model. Well, all very well and good. If you happen to have an extremely popular professional army man, plus the world's largest reserves of oil. My own take on it is that this wasn't socialism, isn't socialism. It might be 21st century, but it's capitalism, and that's what you had. You had redistribution under capitalism. You had a Bonapartist regime that was acting as far as it could to gain popular support against the old elite in the country. And as I said, that attracted admiration in Latin America, but also way beyond. So I can't forget, you had people like Alan Woods, now of the Revolutionary Communist Party, then of Socialist Appeal, International Marxist tendency, going over to Venezuela, giving Chavez a copy of his book, Reason in Revolt. You also had people like Istan Mazaros go over to Venezuela, to give him his blessing. You also had, again, a writer I admire, Michael Leibovitz, the Canadian Marxist, also wrote a book, Beyond Capital. Also, you read his book, it's Venezuela. That's the model that we need to aspire to. Look at Monthly Review in the United States, people like Bellamy Foster, his book on Marx and ecology. Venezuela this is the future of socialism. Well, once America put on sanctions, you get a fall in the price of oil, then things become a lot more difficult, and you have the country malfunctioning. It cannot produce everything that it needs. And I can certainly remember Chavez himself, the founder of the Bolivarian regime, urging his fellow Venezuelans to take cold showers, not in order to cool themselves down, but precisely because of power cuts, because of the shortage of electricity, which is a remarkable thing in such an energy-rich country. And of course, if you look next door at Colombia, if you look at migration into the United States, there's an awful lot of Venezuelans. Venezuelans have been suffering poverty. It isn't just, American Western propaganda. It's a reality that people, have been suffering and seeking to get out. Okay. So in the wider picture, I've already sort of raised the question. I haven't really answered it. Why now? If you look at the situation in Latin America, America itself has been, from what I can tell, quite content with what has been dubbed the pink tide. That you look at various left governments, in Bolivia, Chile, wherever. America hasn't done what it did in the 1950s and, carried out coups. It's been able to live with a leftist government, for example, in Brazil. I'm talking about before Trump, before Belarus, before all of this. But why now? I think that what you've got is an attempt under Trump to reassert American hegemony. I know that that's got a prehistory. But I do take, talk in Washington of a Trump doctrine, coming on, historically, mimicking the Monroe doctrine, basically wanting to reestablish American hegemony over the whole of the Western hemisphere. I therefore do take seriously Trump's talk of Greenland, taking over Greenland. I don't see why we shouldn't take that seriously, given the actual history of the United States. It could do it almost effortlessly. It needs to sponsor some sort of political party, but it could do it. I think clearly Canada is going to be a harder operation, but I wouldn't discount it. And I wouldn't discount, Venezuela being the first of the Latin American countries to come under the knuckle of the Trump doctrine. In other words, first of all, if you topple Venezuela, then Lulu will fall, then Mexico would fall. Whatever else that is considered not cooperating with the United States falls. What's it about? I think it's also about the United States' competition with China. China is the only country that is a genuine full spectrum challenge to the United States. It's not the same, it's not equal. Nonetheless, it is a challenge. And of course, what has happened in Latin America is the United States has been replaced often as the main trading partner, main investment, conduit of investment by China. And that's certainly true when it comes to Venezuela. So in terms of developing these oil resources, where America has been imposing sanctions and sabotaging Venezuela's oil industry, China is offering to invest. And I think that's what you've got going on, a rollback of China, a reassertion of American domination in the Western hemisphere. Having mentioned China, will China intervene in order to support the regime? I read, for what it's worth, in the Financial Times that no, it won't. It'll have a lot of rhetoric against what America has been doing in terms of oil ships, in terms of drug ships, in terms of airspace, in terms of aircraft carriers, in terms of troops, in terms of Nobel Peace Prize winners being smuggled out. Yes, lots of rhetoric, but will it do anything more? And at least what I'm reading is the answer is no, and nor will Russia. It was the same with Iran. Our prediction was that the United States and Israel will attack Iran. Israel first, America then goes in second to support Israel or finish the job or protect Israel or whatever the excuse happens to be. But our prediction was that China would do nothing and Russia would do nothing except diplomatic protests. Well, Iran is sort of in the same neck of the woods as Russia. It's sort of in the same neck of the woods as China. We're talking about, Euro-Asian powers. I think Russia has one aircraft carrier. I think China has maybe two. They are not equal when it comes to sea power. China does not want to rile the United States unnecessarily. Notice its willingness, at least on paper, at least in terms of performance, adhering to American sanctions or Western sanctions on Russia when it comes to its oil. So China, Russia will do nothing, and that gives you something I think of this myth of the BRICS. I can't remember who the guy was that named the BRICS, but he was doing it as a sort of throwaway. It wasn't a serious proposition. We now have conferences of the BRICS. We have the BRICS Plus, but it isn't worth the paper that it's written on. It isn't a serious bloc. It's not an alternative to the United States. It's a series of countries that might not like being dominated by the United States, but cannot coordinate together to do anything about it. And I think Venezuela is an example of that. This is all talk and no ability to act. Okay, so my own take on it, for what it's worth, is that here we have an oil Bonapartism. It isn't any sort of socialism. I wouldn't even characterize it myself as an example of bureaucratic socialism or something like that. It clearly had some socialistic rhetoric. And indeed, I suppose the sort of notable thing actually about Chavez, which I presume Maduro has continued, although not in terms of agitation or much in the way of propaganda from what I can gather, but just more as a tradition, is his Latin American perspective, hence the name Bolivarian. He looks back not to just independence from Spain or independence from Portugal in the case of Brazil, but also the idea of unity of Latin America. That these fighters for independence weren't aiming for a series of well, I was about to say small countries. I don't mean Brazil is small, but they didn't aim to fragment the South American continent. That was much more the job of the British, who, although they didn't colonize South America except for Guyana, they were the hegemonic power. It was British capital that developed the railways. It was British capital, not American capital, and it was Britain that encouraged the breakup or the fragmentation of Latin America, and using local elites who also had their interest in grabbing their bit of the action. And therefore, that was something that the United States continued with. It's the United States has an interest in a weak series of states to its south that it can dominate. Either way, what I'm trying to argue here is we need to look at the Trump doctrine, not simply as the United States will, be just interested in the Western Hemisphere, leave the rest of the world to China, India, Japan, and all the rest of it. On the contrary, what the United States is aiming to do is to secure the Western Hemisphere as part of its reassertion of global hegemony. Therefore, let's just turn very quickly to Mark Rutte, the former, Prime Minister in the Netherlands. He's now Secretary General of NATO. His talk of Europe being at war with Russia, war being imminent. We need to prepare for war. It's certainly true that there's a push in NATO, in particular in Europe, for higher arms spending. I'm not going to call it defense spending, higher arms spending. That is something that the United States is most certainly encouraging. It wants Europe to buy American kit and equipment, things like F-35s. It doesn't want a European arms industry to compete with America. It might get it, who knows? Either way, there's certainly a push to militarize Europe. So we see in Germany, not conscription, but the first step towards conscription. what we're seeing is the upping of arms spending, I think, in virtually every country. The only exception I can think of is Spain, which isn't going down that particular route, and no doubt will suffer consequences as a result of it. Just wanted to add that I hear an awful lot of comrades on the left. I must admit, I sometimes despair of them. That when you look at this talk, and it is talk at the moment, but there's real moves nonetheless in terms of conscription. They say, oh, generation, whatever the hell the generation is now called, they're not going to accept it. Is it Generation Z? I don't know what comes after generation, but they're just not going to go for it. You cannot conscript these people. I just don't buy that. Look, if you look back to the 19th century and you look at the introduction of conscription, you look at France, you look at Prussia, people did join the army, did join the armed forces. If you look at Britain in World War I, when they introduced conscription, the only exception there was Ireland. Elsewhere, people allowed themselves to be conscripted. And the ones that resisted were very few and far between. They were honorable people. They could be Quakers, they could be pacifists, they could be socialists. So, for example, lots of members of the Independent Labour Party refused to be conscripted, and they suffered as a result of that. They suffered imprisonment and extraordinarily harsh conditions. But the mass of people allowed them, the mass of young men allowed themselves to be conscripted. This is from a generation in Europe that was voting socialist. In Britain, they voted Labour. In Germany, they voted for the Social Democratic Party. In France, the Social Democratic Party. So we're talking, about a generation that had been raised on anti-militarist propaganda, had been organized into mass socialist-sponsored trade unions, a socialist international that voted, right, at a series of international congresses to oppose the war that they could see coming. The idea that the present generation is going to be so different from that generation, well, it is different because it hasn't been raised with those traditions. I'm sure no one wants to go out. Well, very few people who are sane want to go out and experience the conditions that we now see, for example, in Ukraine. Only someone who's mad would want to do that. But if you're presented with no choice, and I think that's the reality of it, the majority of people do it. Some people are motivated by patriotism. Some people just do it because they feel they've got no choice. Either way, I think we should take the prospect of conscription seriously. And therefore, what we need to do is discuss what is the socialist attitude to conscription. Well, first of all, I think we should add that we in the CPGB, the Marxist movement, historically support conscription, right? That does not mean that we support the Prussian military system, or for that matter, the Napoleonic system, or for that matter, what was it? Was he Earl Haig of the British Army? Anyway, you know the one I mean. Your country needs you. I know that was 1914 and calling for volunteers, but you get the point. No, we stand for conscription when it comes to a popular militia. That is not only a Marxist demand, that is a democratic demand that goes back to the time of Machiavelli. It's a democratic demand. People say it's a bourgeois demand. I don't mind, but it's also a socialist demand. So yes, we have the slogan, not a man, not a penny for the bourgeois army. That's certainly the case. But we don't take that view of the popular militia for all the reasons that we've explained, that Engels mapped out in his pamphlet, Can Europe Disarm? And so we stand for a popular militia that, if it was given the wrong orders to overthrow, for example, a socialist government, it would rebel, it would mutiny and arrest those that are giving those orders. So that's our strategy. What about a conscription into the bourgeois army? Well, I've already mentioned the honourable attitude that pacifists, Quakers, that socialists in Britain, in particular, the Independent Labour Party. So my understanding, for example, would be that some people like Arpam Dutt, one of the early leaders of the CPGB, refused to be conscripted. Lenin, for example, in his writings, when he's looking at Britain, singles out the ILP as playing an honourable role. He recognises the social pacifism, but he doffs his hat at the heroism of these refuseniks. But what's Lenin's attitude? His attitude is actually join, right? Join up, not out of patriotism, but in order to carry out the slogan of turning the inter-imperialist war into civil war. We need people in the army. We need agitators. We need propagandists. We need organizers in the army. So when it came to the Tsarist army, far from saying to people, don't join up, the Bolshevik message was to join. That didn't mean that when it came to the pacifists in the ILP that he condemned them, but that was the programmatic position of the Bolsheviks. And I'm reminded in that sense of my old comrades in the Communist Party of Turkey. In Turkey, you have to be conscripted if you're a man, if you want to retain your citizenship. There are ways around it. You can pay a bribe. It is a bribe. It's a state bribe, not to some official, but official bribe. I think the conscription goes up to about the age of 50. If you haven't served up to the, you lose your citizenship rights, right? So a lot of old comrades that I've known, if you pay a few £1,000, you can go and you spend your 6 months in some barracks, and it's basically for the old geezers. And they don't make you go through obstacle courses and crawl on your belly and lift weights and go for 26-mile runs and all the rest of it. You have an easy time. You've done your bit. You paid your money. You don't lose your citizenship rights. But what was interesting to me, and this is from the late 60s into the 1970s, Turkey was in crisis. Turkey was experiencing a situation of where the ruling class could not rule in the old way. The working class was organizing. You had a communist party that existed in name that suddenly became a mass party. The biggest demonstrations in the capitalist world on May Day were in Istanbul, 1 million people on the streets. Well, under those circumstances, the Communist Party bracket Ishan and Sesi, Workers' Voice, which was based in London, they urged their comrades not only to obey the law in order to keep their citizenship and get conscripted, they actually urged their university students to get conscripted in the officer corps. Go and learn military technique was the message. And I remember that in particular because the organization was condemned by our comrades in the Spartacus League. And they said, you shouldn't be going for officer training. Well, my take on that is, yes, you should. You actually want a situation where the working class, members of the working class, socialist, communists, actually learn the art of war. This is important for us, as important for us in its own way, as learning the art of speaking, as learning the art of writing, as learning the art of organization. I mean, why on earth don't we want to learn, how an officer, plans a skirmish or a battle. Of course we do. We need that knowledge in our class. We need to spread that knowledge in our class. If we are going to have a popular militia, we need people who can actually, how should it, direct that army. I mean, just to illustrate the point finally on that, notice Trotsky's problem, that they had a Red Army that was made up of Red Guards initially, but then they had to conscript peasants, but they didn't have officers. And so they had to employ bourgeois officers. And what they did is put commissars over them who would countersign their orders. We need our communists in the army, in our popular militia. So that's my remark on that. Just finally, on the whole question of Rutte and Europe and war, I have to say that I don't take Russia seriously as a military power, except when it comes to its nuclear arsenal. And my own take on the Trump 28-point plan, according to the Alliance for Workers' Liberty, Trump is almost a Putin agent. He's just giving Russia everything that it wants. My own take on it, for what it's worth, is that what Trump is attempting to do, I'm very skeptical, is to prize Russia away from China. That the war in Ukraine has pushed Russia into the arms of China. China's being very cautious when it's come to Russia, and Russia's being very cautious about the courtship from America. Well, given the last time under Yeltsin, what happened, you can understand why. And I think that's what America is planning. I mean, I don't know Trump as an individual, whether he's doing that, but people around him, I think, will be doing that. I think Trump himself isn't a fool, will be thinking along those lines. So hence you get proposals from Trump about reviving the Group of Eight, which is the 7 largest capitalist economies. I say capitalist, I'm not defining China as anything at the moment. But it's the 7 largest so-called Western countries. That includes, of course, Japan in the Far East. But last time round, there was a G8. And last time round, Russia was basically stripped of its industries, living standards crashed, and hence the stage is set for Putin. Trump has also been talking about a group of 5. Getting rid of the Europeans. We don't need the Europeans. Having Japan, which has no nuclear weapons, but a large economy. India, China, Russia, America. Again, I'm taking this as more flattery. If you want, I mean, it doesn't really, but if you want to use an analogy, and I'm going to finish with this in terms of what Russia is and Putin and the talk of we're going to do this or that to the Europeans, the sort of saber rattling that Putin and those in his immediate circle go in for, reminds me in a way of The Wizard of Oz. Jeremy Corbyn's been in a production down here along with Sir Ian McLennan. My understanding of The Wizard of Oz is it was propaganda, wasn't it, for the Silver Party in America against the gold standard. Either way, what does the Wizard of Oz turn out to be? He turns out to be a little man from Nebraska that projects his voice, smoke and mirrors. He's fake. And I think that's the reality of Putin. I mean, imagine this. There I am in the Kremlin. There's my president. I'm a general. I come to my president and say, Vladimir, I've got a really brilliant idea. Things have gone so well for us in Ukraine. How about starting a second front on Poland? Come on, comrades. It just isn't real. We're talking, when it comes to Ukraine, of a country that's got a large population, that's true, but a third-rate army. Look at the progress that Russia has made over 4 years nearly now in Ukraine. It already had part of the Donbass. It already had Crimea. It's gained a little bit. At what cost? The idea that Russian tanks are just about to roll into Eastern Europe, I just don't take seriously. Yes, Russia could launch a nuclear weapon and eviscerate Berlin. For what effect? I mean, what's meant to happen? Germany surrenders like Japan did in 1945? I just don't buy. I just don't buy it. Okay, that's just my comment on that. Okay, time, we're going all right. Okay, hopefully we'll get an article this week, but I do think that we do need to mention the Comrades in Palestine action. We have 8 of them on hunger strike, some of them well over 30 days, some of them, I think, a day away now from being on hunger strike for 40 days. That means a considerable loss of body weight. It is something that is putting their lives in danger. What we've got, I think, is something like 3 or 4 of them have been in hospital. I think they're there still. What we've also had is Lammy not responding to correspondence from MPs in his own party, that's John McDonnell, and Jeremy Corbyn, who've written to him as Justice Secretary saying, what is going on with these people? These people are not locked up because they've been found guilty of anything. These people are on remand. These people have been on remand, some of them for a year, right? And what we've got is a government, I think, that's meant to be obliged to put people on trial, isn't it? After 6 months maximum, something like that. You cannot hold people for more than 6 months. Either way, the problem they've got is clear. The government has got 2 problems. One, you've got a judgment coming. I don't know what the hell the judgment will be, but the government didn't succeed in their attempt to block a judicial review of the law banning Palestine Action and, describing it as a terrorist organization. But it also ought to be stressed that these people are not caught under that legislation. These people have been found guilty, I don't know, for spray painting an aircraft, that's been spying for the benefit of the IDF over Gaza, for example. So that's what they're on. That's what they should be on trial for. And the problem that the government's got is that juries, God bless them, do have a habit, if you can get the politics over, of saying, yes, you're guilty, but we're going to find you innocent, which is what I would do if I was on a jury. These people, if they can, will get over their politics and saying, we aren't guilty of a crime. It's the British government is covering up for the genocide that's going on in Palestine, on the West Bank and in Gaza. And the British government is being complicit in that action. In other words, turn the trial of Palestine Action, comrades, into a trial of the government. And that's what Lammy, that's what the Starmer government fears. And that's why we're in solidarity, full solidarity with these comrades. So they ought to be released, of course, from our point of view. If the government wants to put them on trial, put them on trial in front of a jury. And I have confidence that a jury would find them innocent, as they are, of any crime. Okay. Just to add the point that from our angle, of course, the banning of Palestine Action is the thin end of a wedge, as we've seen in the United States with anti-fascism. After one organization, you have others. So the Trump administration has banned or classified as terrorists 4 European organizations, some of which might actually be terrorists. But we know the logic here is to go for one organization after the other. The fact of the matter is that Palestine Action isn't a terrorist organization. It's a protest campaign. And just like the suffragettes, individuals who support it might carry out actions that are illegal, but let a jury decide of whether that was justified or not. But the direction that the Labour government is going is clear and transparent. It's going towards clamping down on protests over Palestine and attack the wider left if it gets any social traction. Okay, last, in terms of the time remaining to me, and maybe here I'm adding 1 and 1 together and making 5, I don't know. And I'm referring to the Socialist Workers' Party. What's going on in the SWP was brought to my attention on Friday, and this was via a post by Dave Renton, who's a member of RS21, and he's the author of a forthcoming book. Let me get it right for Dave's pre-publicity. Revolutionary Forgiveness, Beyond Moralism Towards Liberation. Now, that book is due out in July 2026. And Dave Renton wrote that, 4 leading members of the SWP, Central Committee members, have just been sacked. And my response to that was, I'm very skeptical. Because I know that what's been going on in the SWP over the recent period is you've got a shift in a deliberate planned shift in generation of leadership. That Tony Cliff, he gave way, Chris Harman gave way to the second generation of leaders, people like John Rees, Martin Smith, Lindsay German, comrades like that. That was the second generation of people like Alex Kalinikos, second generation SWPs. And what's going on is the third generation are replacing, in the process of replacing the second generation. So we have Lewis Nilsson as the new national secretary. He replaced Charlie Kimber, who took a back seat as he's the office organizer as of today, as my understanding is. And what we also had is Thomas Tegley Evans coming in as the, I think actually Charlie Kimber was editor of Socialist Worker as well. Either way, Thomas Tegley Evans, a young comrade, has come in and he's editor of Socialist Worker. And if you look at the SWP, it's that sort of process that they've been planning to do. Well, bang, Dave Renton was right. I was wrong, because just like Dave Renton, I presume, we're in receipt of the pre-conference bulletin. This is the bulletin that the SWP publishes internally once every year for, I think, 3 months, beginning in October, ending in December. They have their conference in Camden in January, where they have the elections to the Central Committee and they pass resolutions or not, as the case may be. And because, tell you the truth, comrades, usually the pre-conference bulletin is so boring, I don't bother to read it. So we used to read it avidly, of course, when we had the factional struggle back then in 2013, reading every line, looking at, Charlie Kimber, Alex Kalinikos, China Melville, and other comrades writing, about the Comrade Delta incident and the splits and the arguments and the factions. RS21 comes from that sort of schism. But normally, quite to tell the truth, you read the damn thing, and it's usually, we established a stand up to racism stall in my local town. It was really good, and we got lots of people to sign the petition. Oh, in my college, lots of people read Socialist Worker, and it's jolly good, and we're educating the new comrades. And then you get the dissidents that come in with their particular, particular hobby horse. Yeah, I read you last year. Yeah, I read you the year boring, 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 boring. But this year, I did look at number one, boring, 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 but for precisely that reason. I didn't even bother to look at number two, didn't bother to look at number three until Dave Renton basically brought it to our attention. I went in and looked at pre-conference bulletin number three, and there you are, a statement from the Central Committee announcing that 4 comrades will not be standing. Now, in bulletin number one, they listed out their nominations for the new Central Committee. So comrade so-and-so stepping down after 9 years of full-time work, and we thank you very much, and we're replacing her with comrade X. Or that was bulletin number one. Bulletin number three has Alex Kalinikos, Charlie Kimber, Mark Thomas, Wayman Bennett standing down, not because of age, not because of generation 2 being replaced by generation 3, but because of 2013, because of Comrade Delta, because of Martin Smith. That's the reason they give that these people are standing down. Now, I can't tell you, because I haven't read, I can't tell you whether that's the result in part of internal pressure in the SWP. I don't know. I've not seen any evidence of SWPers saying that these 4, these criminals of 2013 must go. I've not seen anything of the sort. In general, SWPers sadly tend to be very passive, very unrebellious, quite willing to act as the leadership speaking tools. So I've not seen that. Maybe that exists in this branch, but I've not seen the evidence. Maybe it's the result of Lewis and other comrades going up to Liverpool, I don't know, and experiencing the pro-Corbyn camp when they got onto the platform in Liverpool. Yes, the left was dominant in the hall, but when the right hit back, it would attack the SWP. Didn't attack the CPGB, didn't attack RS21, didn't attack the Socialist Party or Socialist Alternative. It picked out the SWP, and it talked about rape. It talked about 2013. And if you read, for example, Owen Jones echoed that in his Guardian piece on Your Party. He said, oh, how dare the SWP lecture your party about democracy? It doesn't even allow factions. Not true, actually, Owen. It doesn't allow permanent factions, but none. And then he went Martin Smith and the cover-up, and there was a cover-up. There's no doubt about it. What you had is complaints about rape. We don't know whether that was true or not. We don't know. There are allegations of rape. And our response initially, my response was, we want to be very careful about carrying this. We'd heard about these accusations. I thought it was some sort of internal power struggle. But no, Andy Newman published it, and we published it in the Weekly Worker. That's where the name Delta comes from. It was someone called Andy Newman. What was it? Socialist Unity published some sort of website. Anyway, the point would be that what came out is that there was a trial, and basically Martin Smith, the national organizer of the SWP, was tried by his mates, tried by his friends, and he was exonerated. And this caused an almighty ruption in the ranks of the SWP. And it's worthwhile pointing out, could it happen again? The comrades say, they issued a statement in 2024 saying, oh, we've got codes of conduct now, and we've got this, and we're really, really, really sorry what happened 10 years or so. Look, the problem is, comrades, what you've got is a how should you put it, a managerial, bureaucratic structure in the SWP. If you had a democratic structure, it doesn't mean that everyone's nice and there's no rape and there's no abuse. And we're products of capitalism. We're products of a male-dominated society for hundreds of years. A democratic structure isn't a miracle, but at least it provides you a better atmosphere, a more transparent atmosphere of where you can take out those above it. The problem in the SWP still, and they still have it, is that the local organizers, right, are appointed from above. So the people we're talking about, my understanding is the people we're talking about who are making the complaints were making the complaints against the person who's their line manager. Right. I asked a full-time SWP worker, I used to know her, and this is under Chris Bambury, and I said to her, what do you call Chris when you go to work in the morning? Well, you know, hi, Chris. Hi, comrade. No, she said, I call him boss. You couldn't make it up because it is a truth. He's responsible for her employment. He's responsible for managing her. How many recruits have you made? How many copies of Socialist Worker did your branch sell? You know, how many pieces of literature? These people are responsible, first of all, to Chris Bambury, but then to Martin Smith. And Martin Smith, apparently, I mean, I don't know, this is just anecdote, would ply them with drinks. Well, are you going to say no to the boss when he's taking you out and being very... So this is the atmosphere that we're talking about. So the SWP has said sorry. But I went, and again, this is the plot thickens. Maybe I'm making too much of it. So normally one of my jobs is to report on Socialist Worker every week. I have to report, they punish me on the PCC, they do. They also make me report on the Socialist, which is cruel treatment beyond anything, you know. But anyway, I read Socialist Worker. So this week I said to myself, I really must read Socialist Worker, not only because I want to find out what the comrades are saying, for example, about this new anti-racism, even broader than Stand Up to Racism Together, along with Friends of the Earth. I want to find out, is Alex Callinicos writing his column? And so I looked for my Socialist Worker online, and I tried it literally before we started this meeting, unavailable. I put in the current edition, unavailable. Now, I don't know what's going on, but I'll pose this to the comrades. If you get rid of Alex Callinicos from the Central Committee, if you get rid of Charlie Kimber from the Central Committee, if you get rid of Mark Thomas, he's the publications officer, if you get rid of Wayman Bennett, are you going to stop selling the books of Alex Callinicos? You're not going to sell Alex Callinicos on your bookstores anymore. You cannot simply get rid of someone from the Central Committee and say, job done. We've disassociated ourselves from these people. You've got the same regime still in place that produced 2013, right? You might not have, come January, the particular individuals that defended the leadership's position, not least Alex Callinicos, but the idea that you've disassociated yourself doesn't ring true. It's a bit like if you take Khrushchev and the secret speech. There was a famous scene apparently at the 20th Congress after Khrushchev had finished his secret speech. The press, international press had been barred. Speech is still leaked. Apparently, this might be an apocryphal story. Someone in the hall shouted out to Khrushchev, "What were you doing?" And Khrushchev apparently turned around. "Who said that? Who said that?" No one, no one. And he said, "That's why. That's what I was doing. I kept my mouth shut because I lived in fear." Right? So I don't think that just getting rid of Alex Callinicos works in the same way that just getting rid of, Stalin dies, you denounce Stalin. Does the Stalin regime live on? Yes, they're no longer killing people on a mass scale, but does the regime carry on? And the answer is yes. Last point, why now? I mean, I've speculated about Liverpool, but is that the reason? Or on the other hand, maybe, and this is again speculation, maybe because Dave Renton's book is coming out in July 2026, we understand that his lawyers, and we're talking about the lawyers of the publishing company, has written to at least 4 people who we understand are in the SWP. Basically, this is a lawyer's letter asking you to comment on the relevant chapter. That's my understanding. These are the accusations that the author, Dave Renton, will be making in his book that's coming out in July. What is your comment on this? And who knows, if that book comes out, it could potentially open a can of worms for the SWP. Did they cover up rape? Did they know that there was a rape? I mean, I don't know, but did they know? They were working with Martin Smith. They knew Martin Smith. They knew what the accusations were. They know more than I know. So who knows what that means for the SWP? But I'm making the case that I don't think this will rescue the reputation of the SWP. But maybe there's other developments that we're not aware of that are going on. Maybe the 4 are resisting. Maybe people around them are resisting. We just don't know. But it is strange, isn't it? That at least for me, maybe it's my technical incompetence, but I can't find a copy of Socialist Worker available online. So the plot is there. I think something's going on. We've had the announcement in the pre-conference bulletin. As I said, a democratic regime doesn't solve such problems, but a democratic regime helps knock down the sort of hierarchy and the sort of cult of leadership that you've had in the SWP around people like Martin Smith and Banbury, Alex Kalinikos, and people like that. I'm going to finish there.
Thank you very much, Jack. A lot for people to get their teeth into. The chat has been quite active, certainly was quite active around the question of conscription. I don't know whether Sandy McBurney would like to come in and raise his points to you directly. Sandy, or are you happy for me to go through the points that you made in the chat? I'll take that as you're happy to take me through the points. Okay, so on conscription, there were various kind of oppositions to what you were saying, Jack. There was opposition from Rafal, who used the example of Ukraine, and the people kind of avoiding conscription in Ukraine and desertions in the Ukrainian army as an example of people opposing conscription. Comrade Frank talked about 2 million dead in the Ukrainian war, and that might discourage people. Sandy McBurney took the view that the masses would oppose conscription and that we should build a mass movement against conscription, that there was very little support for war amongst the masses against Russia or China. And then there was a final question on that general kind of issue about the war in Ukraine from Noel Gagan. Asked if you took seriously at the time, presumably in 2022, the predictions that Russia and Putin specifically would invade Ukraine. I've got a question around the Venezuela segment of your presentation. I did hear someone speaking in a forum recently, and I unfortunately can't remember what the forum was, talking about the Venezuelan government issuing arms to, whether it's the population in general or whether they're I mean, if you were sensible, you'd issue arms to those you deem to be loyal. But segments of the population in Venezuela, as one of the options in the event of presumably a land invasion by US forces, and what your thoughts are on that. I do have Jim Nelson indicated to speak, so if I bring Jim in, and I'll leave you to kind of gather your thoughts around those particular questions. Jim, if you'd like to unmute.
Thank you. Just in passing, I seem to be able to get the Socialist Worker site with articles dated from the 12th and Alex Kalinikos there. I don't know. Anyway, Venezuela. Yeah, of course, the big news is Machado getting the Nobel Peace Prize. Perhaps they should call it the Kissinger Prize until maybe next year when Trump gets it. But there's been a couple of articles online about her. And one of the main things is that she supported the coup against Chavez in 2002 and has been on that side of things, i.e. with the elite, all the time. And she loves Trump as well. So I'm looking at the Guardian and the Observer the last few days, and I don't suppose the rest of the mainstream press and BBC and so on are any better. But there's no history. It's like Maduro came in and oil prices plummeted, everything was badly handled, and so on and so on. And there's just a passing glance at sanctions, including that this tanker was actually evading sanctions against maritime law. It's absolutely nonsensical. You think they don't even look at what they themselves were publishing over 20 years ago. It's the same with Ukraine. Putin in 2022, whatever it was, he just suddenly invaded for no great reason. Gaza, they said in The Guardian for over a year that this war was triggered by Hamas, October the 7th, and so on and so on. I suppose because they reckon that a lot of their readers don't really follow much of the history, read a great deal about the background or anything like that. The American interest, I do recall 20 odd years ago, some things. The Koch brothers were getting their oil from Venezuela, I believe, and it is a heavy oil. And no, not like Saudi oil. When that failed, they need to have this pipeline from the Arctic to go down to their refineries. So I'm sure that there's large sections of the oil industry who would very much like to have that oil back. And of course, Machado would love the Americans to have the oil and anything else they want, actually, in Venezuela. And yes, it is continuation, well, a redoing of the oh dear, the what's it doctrine for South America. And I read a while back, I mentioned it, I think, about no God but gain.
Monroe.
Sorry?
Monroe
Doctrine.
Yeah, good grief. Northern bankers were financing the slave trade to Cuba and financing plantations there. When carrying slaves on American ships became illegal, in the southern states, they relied on births to keep the slave population going. In Cuba, they just carried slaves there and let them die, work to death. And the Monroe Doctrine was because they were worried that Britain might buy Cuba off Spain, apparently, That was the sort of spark. But it's clearly been the case for a long time. And Britain had a major role in Latin America, had a major role all over the place, of course, until the Americans took over. But now there's massive trade between Latin America and China. Soybeans, for instance, where Trump's tariffs have managed to collapse large parts of the US agriculture, including the soybean farms, and the Chinese are buying them off Brazil. But yeah, and the thing that struck me just these last few days was, as I said these things in the paper, they don't seem to have any conception whatsoever, or not, rather not actually publishing it, any conception of background as to why these things happen. It's just Maduro is a dictator, and so we should get rid of him. Get Trump to get rid of him? Is there any record anywhere at any time of the United States government lifting a finger for freedom and democracy anywhere in the world? That's it.
Thank you very much, Jim. I don't currently have anyone else indicated to speak. So I was wondering, Jack, whether you wanted to come back in on the points that were made via the chat at this point.
Yeah, I mean, apologies, I'm not reading the chat. I don't normally read the chat because I have to put the glasses on, and sometimes goes so quickly.
There you
I
go.
can't follow it. Either way, thanks for the questions. I agree that there's no mass sentiment wanting to go to war with Russia or China. That isn't really the point I'm making. The point I'm making actually is that in 1914, for example, the working class was organized into mass socialist parties that showed no enthusiasm for war. And yet there was war and people were conscripted. That's the point I'm making. So, of course, I recognize that, people aren't out there in Trafalgar Square saying we've got to go to war with Putin. I'm well aware of that. But I'm saying in spite of people being very sensible and not wanting to go to war, war still happens and conscription happens. And people do allow themselves to be conscripted. That's the argument I'm putting forward. So I'm well aware that, if you stood on if Reform, for example, or the Tories next election stood on, we're going to go to war with Russia, it would not be a vote winner. But that's not my argument. If that's Sandy, I'm not suffering from that illusion. I'm simply stating what I consider a fact, that whatever a particular generation happens to think in terms of war, usually they're pretty sensible and don't want to go to war. In spite of that, people allow themselves to be conscripted. And it's a question then of what attitude. Do we take the attitude as a socialist as opposed to me as an individual? Would a socialist party say that here you are, the country that we're living in is engaged in a war, and we advise you to leave the country? So the socialists, good socialists, all you good socialists should get out. So the advice, for example, in Russia would be, from abroad, there you are, as Lenin sitting there in Poland or Switzerland. What you Bolsheviks should do is get out of Petrograd. You shouldn't allow yourself to be working for the war machine in the Putilov factory. You shouldn't allow yourself to be conscripted. Get out of the country. No. So we're talking about unjust wars. And what we're arguing is that the job of communists is to fight in the army, to agitate in the army, to turn the army, to split the army. And you're going to have a better job of splitting the army if you've got good communists in the army than if you told them to go abroad. You told them to flee. the country. So that's the argument. That's Lenin's argument, right? So Lenin was, as I said, I've tried to stress it. If you read Lenin, he's full of admiration when it comes to Britain, because you've got the Labour Party, the official Labour Party, in coalition government from 1916. And he contrasts it with the ILP, and he picks out the ILP in particular, not the BSP, but the ILP. And he says, these people are really heroic. Look at the conditions that they're enduring. He's full of admiration.
I'm still in the thing.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Toby.
I don't mind a heckle, but anyway, that's my argument. So, okay, how would you apply it in Ukraine? Well, where's the Socialist Party? But it's an attitude. Would we, for example, right, if we were organized in Ukraine, say get out of Ukraine? Well, if you get out of Ukraine, you've got no possibility of organizing in Ukraine, have you? If you're in Ukraine and I think it's above 25, isn't it now? Or is it 23? I can't remember what the conscription age is. It's vastly high, isn't it? Either way, would you say what you should do, comrades, is get out of Ukraine? Well, that's really helpful, isn't it? What should you do if you're in Russia? Get out? It's not an answer to a working class. It's not a working class answer, is it? It's an individual answer. It's a very understandable answer, but it clearly isn't. First of all, you get out of the country and then you overthrow the government. How are you going to overthrow the government from outside? You're going to organize an international brigade of exile. It doesn't work, comrades. Sorry. So I've also then put forward my argument. Of course, we'd oppose conscription. That goes without saying. So in Germany, of course, we would be out with the kids opposing this new law, this new measure, because this is about their army, right? And what I argued, though, is we would be arguing there for a popular militia, which would require conscription. So we're not cheerleading NATO. We're not cheerleading the German government or whatever. Quite the opposite. We're saying this is our alternative to their professional standing army. I've used the slogan, not a man, not a penny. I mean it. But that doesn't mean we're pacifists. We need our own military program. And our own military program is a people's militia. I find it remarkable that with Trotskyist comrades, and I'm not saying, who's speaking from what, but you raise the question of a militia and you usually get from some of them, you get a sneer. Oh, that's a bourgeois demand. Yeah, okay. It's a bourgeois demand, i.e. the democratic bourgeoisie going back to Machiavelli raised the demand for a militia. But it's something that is being taken up by the First International, something that was taken up by the Communist Party in Germany of Marx and Engels, something taken up by the Second International. It's a tradition that I would adhere to. So the popular militia needs to be revived. We're not pacifists. We need armed force, right, to oppose the slave owners' rebellion that the bourgeoisie would organize, for example, if we look like we would win a majority in the House of Commons. What else are you going to do? You're going to turn to this army, this professional army? None of us have joined. No. Well, you try to split it. The most effective way of splitting it is, one, if you've got an army, and two, if you're in their army. That's the argument I'm putting forward. So we're in the business of not coming up with individual solutions, but class solutions, international solutions. And therefore, you've got to take the question of the army seriously. And if you think that you just leave the country, that's not a serious, that's an individual answer for an individual problem. It's not an answer for the international working class. Someone raised 2022. I'm not sure. Was I wrong? Yes, I was wrong, but for the right reasons, precisely because look what has happened over the last nearly 4 years now. Look at Russia, look at Russia's army. It hasn't rolled over Ukraine. And that's why I thought they wouldn't invade. I didn't think they would be effective. And they haven't been effective. They've been extraordinarily ineffective. This wasn't, in my view, going to be a rerun, if they went ahead, of Georgia, that the government in Kiev just surrenders and it's all over. No, I thought they would get bogged down. I thought there would be a prolonged war. I didn't know what the result would be, but if I was there in the Kremlin giving advice to Vladimir Putin, I would have said, don't do it. Now, he had reasons to do it. He was boxed in and forced to do it by the Americans, whatever. But I still wouldn't have done, and I wouldn't have done it with the forces that he had at his command. It just didn't work out to me as a force that was big enough to do the job, and it wasn't. And they failed, and they're still failing, in my opinion. Okay, Andy, look, I've got, when I introduce my remarks on better, I waved a flag. I've got no special insight. I don't know whether the arms that have been distributed are going to be distributed to people who will fight to the death. This is the question. And you'd have to be there to know that, right? You can give someone a gun, but are you prepared not only to use it, but to die? Maybe people do, I'm not able to judge. I'm just not able to judge. It could be you're right, but what is the American plan? I mean, I again shrug my shoulders. I don't know. Is it, for example, I mean, they could do it with very few soldiers, find out where Maduro is at a particular moment, go in there with the helicopters and the Marine force, lift him out and put him on trial, or let him swim in the middle of the Atlantic, or whatever. I don't know. So it's possible that it could turn out to be a quagmire for the Americans. I'm just skeptical. That's all. You could be not. I'm not saying you argued it, but that is a possibility. And surely, that would be something the Americans will be calculating, and they might have calculated. Look, we'll threaten a ground force, but we won't do it. I don't know. It's possible that they will use ground forces, but I don't know. I could tell you this: when it came to Iraq, I was predicting days. I don't know if you remember back then. We had the non-stop picket of the American embassy, and I promised comrades that when the war starts, it will be a matter of days. I think it was nearer hours, wasn't it? So you can overthrow a regime, bang, very easily. Can you then put something in place? Well, what America shows at the moment, what America has shown for years now, is that what it brings is not what it did in Japan, what it did in West Germany, what it did in Western Europe, what it did in Korea, for that matter. Okay, Vietnam War and all the rest of it. It just brings destruction. It brings social breakdown. So I'm thinking Iraq, I'm thinking Somalia, I'm thinking Libya. And I think that's a much more likely scenario. But again, I don't know. All I'm really doing is flagging the danger of America carrying out some sort of coup operation, and whether that ends in a Mossadegh scenario or a breakdown of society and civil war, I haven't got a clue. But I don't think things will end well. That's really the argument that I've got.
I've got a number of people indicated to speak, including Sandy, but I'll start with Toby Absey. Toby, would you like to unmute, please?
All right. Okay.
Sorry. Can you hear us now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah.
Good.
Okay. I'm trying to sit somewhere where you can actually see me. In terms of Latin America, I mean, today in Chile, it looks as if Kast, the son of a Nazi, a German Nazi who went to Chile after 45, and who is a Pinochet enthusiast, and basically, I would say is a fascist, will be elected president against the communist woman who is the other candidate. I acknowledge that this is partly due to Boric's incompetence and backsliding when he was president. But I mean, I think this is awful. In terms of other things going on in Latin America, in Honduras, the election there, the relatively left-wing candidate, I'm not saying he was particularly left-wing, but was in third place. But then there were two others, right? One who was a far right and one of whom was slight, right, but not as far right. And the one who was right, but not the furthest right, wasn't liked by Trump. At one point, the counting stopped for a period. And then when the counting reopened, the most extreme one was ahead, which, I mean, shows the American attitude towards elections in Latin America, that they weren't even satisfied that the right, not particularly, I'm not trying to say was that moderate a right winger, but the right winger who was not the most extreme might win. He had to be stopped, and you fiddle the election so that the most extreme rightist wins. And also in relation to Honduras, Trump pardoned a previous president who was in jail in the United States, who had been extradited. He'd been extradited by the Honduran government in response to America asking them to extradite him because he was in prison for massive cocaine trafficking. And I mean, this makes a complete nonsense of the allegations against Maduro as the trafficker in chief, when the real cocaine trafficker is released, is pardoned by Trump. And also, if you look at the sanctions that have been done against Brazil, because Bolsonaro was being punished, not particularly harshly in my view, but was being punished at all, you have massive sanctions against Brazil coming from the United States. So I have the sense, and in Bolivia, the MAS, the Movement Towards Socialism, is completely fallen to bits, and I think Arce has been charged with something or other and has been arrested. This was not the more charismatic guy. Sorry, I can't now remember, but there was one who was of indigenous origin who was the most famous of them. But I mean, he looks as if he could well be charged with something else and put inside. And so you're getting this Trump-Monroe doctrine being used all over Latin America. I mean, quite apart from, when it looked as if Milei in Argentina wouldn't win local elections or something, Trump made all sorts of threats against the Peronists or promises what he'd do to help Milei and blah, blah, blah. So that is very much the case. The Chile thing is awful to me. I mean, just the memory of that. On the conscriptions thing, in relation to the Ukraine, I mean, I know the conscription age was 27 and went down to 25, but there was this law saying that all men between, I think it was 18 and 60, were supposed to stay in the country. Well, in terms of, you're saying individual solutions leaving the country, or masses of young men left the country. Masses. I mean, it's not all women and kids who went to Western Europe in response to conscription being brought in. And you've got quite considerable desertions going on, and you've got people refusing to be conscripted, and press gangs are going around and they beat up the guys who are doing the press ganging, or the things happen at the recruitment office and stuff like that. So I mean, I think it's not just an individual thing. It's a mass thing. You may not think it's politically the best thing, but they don't want to die. I mean, okay, the Azov enthusiasts and probably some other people who joined in the first instance, often middle-aged men, but were keen at the beginning. But I mean, even they are, I think, getting a bit fed up now that no one is replacing them, and the tour of duty is going on and on. So that is something about conscription. In relation to Palestine Action, the jury thing, I think I'm not saying that it's the only reason why most crimes other than rape and murder will no longer be tried by jury, but I think that it is designed to stop political acquittals. And I think that was to do with Palestine Action. Okay, there've been two in the last sort of slightly over a fortnight now. There've been two general strikes in Italy again. They've one by what I would characterize, I know it's rather a loose characterization, as anarcho-syndicalist unions, USB and CUB and COBAS and so on, and another one by the CGIL, which is the largest union and the most left wing of the mainstream confederations. Now, I mean, they were okay against the budget, and they were against the budget because it was even more than her previous free budgets, an austerity budget, and sort of complaints about wages and pensions and all this sort of stuff. But also, both those unions, both sets of unions, were talking about opposing rearmament. I mean, that was what to me was particularly interesting about it, was that they come out openly to attack, what Ursula von der Leyen has come up with, Rearm Europe, whilst the main so-called left party, the PD, is just saying they want a European army rather than individual countries rearming. And I think it's interesting that the unions are more, at least some unions, those who are fighting back to some extent, anyway, are taking up this question. And I think that may be a reflection of people not wanting a permanent war economy. I mean, it looks as if Fiat cars are, it's no longer called Fiat officially, but anyway, they're being run down. The steel industry is being wound up. But what they clearly intend to do is to concentrate on arms production. The reason you're trying to balance the budget, get under the 3% limit imposed by the latest Stability Pact, is so that the infraction procedure will no longer apply from next year, and you can borrow money, masses of money from the EU for the purpose of arms. Anyway, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Toby. I have Paul Flewers. Paul, if you'd like to unmute.
Yeah, sure. On the question of people's militia and versus standing army or conscript army, I think if we look back at Trotsky's arguments in the late 30s into the war, where he was trying to key into the anti-fascist sentiments that were common across the working class and middle class, and that's why he had the what we called proletarian military policy, which was to raise democratic demands within conscripts' armies to force radical change there and to enable to turn an imperialist war into an anti-fascist war. This applied to the bourgeois democracies. It didn't apply, of course, to Germany or Italy, the fascist powers of Japan. But that, I think, was a good attempt to do this. Now, it's interesting that in the Second World War, the British ruling class had to use the slogans of the left, more the Popular Front left, and even Churchill grudgingly sort of used these terms. And you had in the army big discussions and debates about what is this war about, because the bourgeoisie were canny enough to know, the sensible members of the bourgeoisie were canny enough to know that the God, King and Country slogans of the First World War weren't going to work, and that you needed to key into popular demands in order to fight an imperialist war, which is why Britain went to war. It wasn't for democracy. Now, it's interesting, the Communist Party, although it took part in these debates, never really put forward in its propaganda. And I've been through a lot of their stuff in the war. They never put forward demands like this. They came more or less by accident, very briefly at the time of the fall of France, to something that was similar to the military policy, but dropped it very quickly. Very strange, a very strange episode, which raises more questions than it answers, but we'll discuss that perhaps another time. But I think for converting a bourgeois army into a workers' militia, I think you have to have, one, a war in which people are supporting it on the grounds of progressive ideas, anti-fascism. Secondly, you've got to have a large conscript army with larger numbers of people who are ready to be radicalized within it. And I think the calls for, at the moment, conscript armies in Europe is not going to go very far, because they had all these problems before, that a conscript army only works if the population agrees with the reason for it to be set up in the first place. There was the dog king and country thing and volunteering in the First World War, but that didn't wash in the 30s. So they had to use anti-fascism because people thought it was an anti-fascist war, because Britain was fighting a fascist power. At the moment, they're trying to ratchet up the Russian threat. I mean, it's, in one sense, it's ridiculous. I mean, Jack's mentioned the ineffectiveness of the Russian army. I'll come on to that, because I think there's actually a lot more nuance in that. But the idea that Russia is going to attack Western Europe, the idea that it's going to take all of Ukraine, or wants to take all of Ukraine, is just nonsense. But they're bigging up this thing all the time, and Labour is as bad as anyone else. And I think here, this is the way I think Starmer feels he's going to get Britain back into Europe, is on a question of militarism, that Britain is part of Europe militarily. I think that's something we could discuss at some point. But the question of Ukraine, there's a lot of things which Jackson, I think, need a bit more depth on it. The invasion force in 2022, initially, it failed because, yes, it wasn't sufficient, but the premise on which the Russians invaded was that the Russian-speaking Ukrainians would either be in favor of incorporation into Russia, or being forced, the government change being forced militarily, or at least would be neutral. And they got that very, very wrong. The invasion force would have been sufficient if they'd have been going into friendly country, but they weren't. Outside of the Donbass and the Crimea, it just didn't, pro-Russian sentiments had very much disappeared after 2014 with the annexation of the Crimea. The Russian forces have been effective in one sense, and this is the important thing, of grinding down the Ukrainian army to the point where it is having trouble defending the remnants of the Donbass that it still holds. There's a very real possibility that the Ukrainian army could just disintegrate under desertions, which are running at thousands a week, on a pure military power, because unless you had full intervention by NATO into this war, Russia was always going to prevail through a war of attrition. And that's what's happening. And I don't think, even with these blood-curdling calls that we get from the European leaders, that they are actually going to intervene into Ukraine militarily. They'll just ratchet it up. Yes, there'll be intervention in the sense of technical support by Europe, but that's not the same as getting physically involved in this war. There is something which I think we could have discussed, and that is this move by the Europe bureaucracy to sequester the Russian funds being held by Euroclear. because I think this is really important. They've had to bend the rules somewhat tortuously in Brussels to enable this to take place. And they're also bending the rules for future, that this sequestration can't be paid back to Russia unless you actually have a free vote in the European Parliament, which means that any any anti-Russian countries, guarantee that the Baltic states will do their job there, will stymie any move to release the money. And also, the sequestering of Russian money to give to Ukraine is predicated, really, in the longer term, on Russia's defeat. Now, if Russia comes out and, as I expect, will have a sort of frozen conflict and surrender more or less on Russian terms, the fact that Europe has run off with several 100 billion of Russian funds means that relations with Russia are going to be poisonous for the foreseeable future. And that's, again, is going to be difficult in respect of stability within Europe. You have permanent instability in Russian-European relations. And if America does re-establish some sort of modus vivendi with Moscow, that's going to cause a lot of trouble in transatlantic relations as well. Presumably, the Europeans are hoping that Trump will be replaced by a neocon who'll go back to a classic anti-Russian standpoint. Yeah, I think that's about it, basically. Yeah.
I'm unclear whether we still have Sandy McBurney. There was a message indicating that he was driving. He did flash up on my screen very briefly and has now disappeared. So unless we've got indication otherwise, I'm going to move to Mike McNair.
Sorry, Sandy is here.
Oh, he's here. Sorry. If you, yeah. Well, let's take Mike and then I'll bring in Sandy.
Okay, 3 points. The first of which is the judgment. It's fairly clear, actually, that the Putin administration was advised that they could deliver a knockout blow in 2022 in the same way that they delivered a knockout blow in Georgia. That is to say, to strike directly with the blitzkrieg approach, to strike directly at the Ukrainian capital, and the Ukrainians would then be forced to come to terms, as the Georgian government was forced to come to terms in 2008. The reason why they were advised that is, for some reason, and I think it's probably due to the smoke and mirrors of the first Trump administration, that it wasn't transparent that the Trump administration had heavily rearmed the Ukrainian armed forces with anti-tank and anti-air weapons, with the result that the strike against Kiev turned into a turkey shoot of Russian armor, which then led into, we have to have this slow grinding operation. So whatever it's from the Russian point of view, my understanding, it's an intelligence failure, that they didn't actually understand the extent to which the United States had rearmed the Ukrainian, rearmed and retrained the Ukrainian army for the purposes of preventing a knockout blow. Second, in that context, I know Jack is clearly right in the sense that the US government would like to detach Russia from its alliance with China. But the US government is not, in fact, and Trump's 28 points, in spite of all the rhetoric in the West European press and in the Democratic Party press in the United States, do not amount to a surrender to Putin. do not amount to a surrender to the Russian government. What's being proposed is freezing the conflict, in essence, freezing the conflict at its present front lines and leaving NATO troops, NATO control within striking distance of Moscow. And the idea that this is and leaving it also the case that it continues to be the case that as has been demonstrated, that as long as the Ukrainians still hold Odessa, as long as the Ukrainians still hold coastline, then Ukrainian proxy operations cripple the Russian Black Sea Fleet and keep the Russians out of having an effective warm water naval port. So that what Trump is offering the Russians is that they can have a sphere of influence on condition that they accept unconditional military subordination to the United States and large-scale US quote US intervention, and large-scale US quote investment, i.e., buying up US private equity operations, buying up Russian assets. And I do think, in essence, that if the Russian administration accepts Trump's proposals, that will be fatal to the Russian administration. It will amount to be perceived as a radical defeat of the Russian administration. And then, second point, more generally, we have to recognize, and it's really fundamental to grasp this, that what's going on is the end of the regime, the post-1945 regime. We got Neil Ferguson making the same point in yesterday's Times, that what Trump is proposing is a return to the 19th century regime of international relations. That is a return to open imperialism, a return to open colonialism, a return to open great power politics on the basis of power and negotiation versus international law, international institutions, multilateralism is all going. This is all going. The smarticists are actually broadly correct to say, I don't think it's what their solution is right, but it's fundamental. This is a fundamental turn. We are not in the games within the Cold War. We are not in the games within the unilateral moment. We are in back to pre-1914. Third thing, the war and conscription and so on and so forth. My understanding of the point that Jack is making is which is just a return to classic Leninism. It is not the case that the workers' movement can stop the capitalist state from going to war by any means other than immediately overthrowing the capitalist state. There is no means short of the immediate overthrow of the state which can prevent a state from going to war. There's no means short of the immediate overthrow of the state which can prevent the state from manipulating the public press and the public arena to the point of creating a sufficient basis of consent. And it doesn't have to be a perfect, overwhelming majority consent, but it's just enough consent for an August 1914. And Jack made the point again, in the run-up to August 1914, there were enormous mass anti-war demonstrations. There were enormous mass anti-war demonstrations. There were campaigns for the general strike to stop the war. There were calls for the general strike to stop the war. The Second International had called for the general strike to stop the war in 1912. But in reality, when it came to the crunch, each of the individual parties of the Second International fell in behind their own state. And each of the individual parties of the Second International fell in behind their own state, partly because the whole international was built on socialism in one country, or put another way, the dictatorship of the proletariat in one country. Yeah. And the only people who were actually thinking at the level of there's going to be world war poses the question of world revolution is either the Leninist minority or the what let's call it the Parvacist minority, which thought that backing German imperialism to win was the way for the working class to obtain power. But then in that context, it's also equally the case. It's delusional to suppose that mass resistance to the draft, in the absence of, if we imagine the Vietnam War and you just had the anti-draft movement and you didn't have the Vietnamese army shooting, the North Vietnamese army shooting back, you're not going to get the defeat of the United States in Vietnam. And in order to have the North Vietnamese army shooting back, you didn't just have to have the anti-war movement in the United States, you had to have the arms factories running, in particular in the Soviet Union, because China backed off at a fairly early stage from supporting North Vietnam. It's not, it's the way in which people are thinking about this in that sense is delusional. Then in that context, we want to overthrow the capitalist state apparatus and the capitalist state system. It's utterly delusional to imagine that that's going to happen in any way other than either politically infiltrating and breaking up the bourgeois armed forces, the capitalist armed forces, and breaking them apart politically, which in a sense began to happen in the Vietnam War movement, but certainly is the essence of what happened in 1916 through 1919. Or alternatively, through prolonged people's war. And the idea that we can perform prolonged people's war in a country which isn't an overwhelmingly peasant majority country is equally delusional. So I think comrades have to think, it's pointless to have hope there'll be an anti-conscription movement and this will stop them going to war. Is delusional. That's it.
Thanks, Mike. I've had indication that Sandy is available, but I can't see him on my display.
Yeah, he came and left.
Yes, I thought that was the situation. Okay, so thanks for all that. I've got no one else to indicate, or has indicated. I'm conscious of time. So, Jack, we'll come back to you to respond and to sum up. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. Yeah, I would have been interested to hear Sandy. Yeah, I mean, just on what Paul was saying, I mean, I don't know much about the CPGB and World War II in that particular respect. All I know about is sort of myth. Well, not myth, but, I've heard it and not studied it, but the Alexandria Soldiers' Parliament, for example. And I mean, what is noticeable, as I understand it, about the 45 election is that the Tories won it. My understanding is won it on the home front and totally lost it in the army. I don't know what that tells you, but the argument I'm putting forward really, I think, is quite simple. And that's, first of all, that, Toby's, well, what's going on in Ukraine? I mean, let's just make it up, Toby. Let's say 1 million men have got out of Ukraine, just for the sake of the argument. And Toby says, well, that's not individual action, that's mass. Yes, it's mass because you put them all together and you can add up 1 and 1 and 1 makes 1 million. But this isn't 1 million people acting in unison. in a disciplined way. If I issued the instructions, or if there was someone there that could issue the instructions, right, the 1 million people that left Ukraine will now come back. No one's going to obey you. This is individual action, Toby. This isn't a party. This isn't some mass movement that is obeying or can be directed anywhere. So I think it is precisely individual action carried out on a mass scale. But it's not the answer, is it? If you tell me the answer is to just leave the country, that's the answer to World War III, is it? Well, clearly it's not. It's a nonsense. I'm not saying for an individual would want to save themselves, but given that we're living in an interconnected world, I mean, what do you want me to do about, for example, the threat of US war against China? Urge people on an individual basis to leave China? It's just absurd. So no, it doesn't work. And we're not for Russia. At least I'm not. So what should we do? Urge people in Russia to leave? Well, it's the whole thing's that's not a political answer. That's the argument I'm putting forward. So desertion. If you look at the Bolsheviks, they were faced with mass desertions, in 1917. What's the Bolshevik message? Do not desert. Don't leave the front line. That's the Bolshevik message, right? Elect representatives. Send your delegates to the Soviets. Don't go back to the village, right? What's the phrase? Don't put your bayonet in the ground and walk. So the Bolsheviks were for turning what was an inter-imperialist war into a civil war, and that should be our approach. And if you don't take that approach, tell me what the solution is. And my argument is, again, just to repeat the point, my argument isn't that you don't join an anti-conscription demonstration. So I use the example of Germany. I mean, there you are. They're not introducing conscription, but they're introducing measures that are clearly a step in that direction. But what you do on that demonstration is precisely raise the question of a popular militia. We need our military policy, and that must include conscription, not their conscription, our conscription. So we would vote, if we were in Parliament, for a budget that says we're going to finance a popular militia, perhaps, not unconditionally. But anyway, that's the argument that we're putting forward. So we need our military policy, and that isn't pacifism. It's not individual desertion. It's not leaving the country. It's precisely engaging with the politics of the country, including the politics of the army. And all I can tell you is when I was young, because of British troops in Ireland, in the Young Communist League in my town, we were getting recruits in the British Army. The problem was that King Street, as we called it, didn't want to know. It should have wanted to know. It should have organized. There was big discontent. Didn't we have an officer? I can't remember his name. I remember his partner, Liz Curtis, I think was her name. Anyway, she paired up with this officer who again rebelled. There was rebellion in the British Army, and with communists in the British Army, that could have become effective. But the communists didn't want to know. We should want to know. I appreciate Paul Fleur's again remarks on Trotsky, and it shows you the necessity, Paul, I think, of there's a concrete circumstance and you apply your policy concretely to it. And you shouldn't, in my view, simply say that World War II is simply and only a rerun of World War I, for example. It's more complex than that. Yes, from Britain's point of view, it was fighting to preserve the British Empire, no doubt about that. But that isn't the be-all an end all of the war. I don't buy the idea that you can't have conscription unless the population supports the war. Look, I did notice someone saying that the communists loads of communists supported the Nazis. Well, I'm sure that's right statistically, but what is noticeable in Germany till the very end is mass working class opposition to the Nazis, right? They didn't win the working class. The problem was that when you had, for example, the French Communist Party under instructions of Moscow, what they wanted was an anti-German war, right? Not a class war. So again, I would simply raise the idea, at least, that one policy, I mean, in terms of the Soviet Union, how did it fight the Nazis? It says it's the Hun. And it fought against, it was a people war, one people against the other. Didn't fight a class war. Look at the difference between the Red Army under Trotsky, who could recruit people from other people's armies into your army, right? So we want a class war, and precisely the German working class was never reconciled as a class, if you can call it a class, but as a population, never reconciled to the Nazis. And those people were conscripted. They were serving in the German army, and we ought to have had a policy to win them. Right, that's my argument. And if you don't have that policy, what's your policy? So the idea that you're going to resist conscription, I just don't buy it. Not when it gets near, right? When people are dying. I mean, just look how successful they've been so far on the Ukraine war in Britain. No British involvement. When was the last and only Stop the War demonstration? I think a couple of us on this call attended it. It was humiliating for the organizers. A few thousand people, and the demonstration was headed by the Ukraine Solidarity Campaign, right? That was the demonstration. And they've never dared since initiate a demonstration around the Ukraine question. Maybe they ought to. Either way, notice how the population was manipulated over Ukraine. You know, we'll open our houses, these were nice migrants, weren't they? We'll up our taxes. So we ought to be aware, you know, that as the drums of war get louder, right? Yeah, people are persuaded, people are cowed. So I just don't buy the idea that the present generation wouldn't fall for war propaganda, where the generation of 1914 did. The generation of 1914 were more internationalist, more socialist, more organized, more class conscious, and yet they allowed themselves to be led into the war. So we need to have a realistic perspective and not clutch on to, I think, pacifist illusions that all we need to do is say something like, we all say no, or something along those lines. I don't think that is a worthy policy for socialists. And no one's spoken about the SWP. I am crushed and disappointed, but I'm going to finish there. 4 minutes past 7. Thank you, Andy. And yeah, it's been interesting debate.
It has been a very interesting debate. And yes, it's a shame we didn't have more discussion around the SWP. Interesting to see how that develops over the next period, especially as they have their conference in January and what the fallout there will be. Yes, so comrades, thank you very much for your contributions and your time this evening. As I said at the top of this session, we have one more online Communist Forum and before the Christmas break, so that will be back here again at 5 o'clock next Sunday. I wish you all a lovely evening, and we'll see you then. Thank you very much for your time.
Maybe invite Dave Renton for next week. That might be interesting.
Oh, yes, that's an interesting suggestion indeed. Okay, comrades, we'll see you next week.